The small suburban town of Greenfield had always been known for its peaceful streets and tight-knit community. The residents prided themselves on the low crime rate and the quiet, predictable rhythm of their daily lives. But this calm was shattered one morning when Sarah Michaels, a 16-year-old girl, was reported missing. Panic spread quickly, and the entire town seemed to stop in its tracks. People rushed to their cars, eyes glued to the news, and mothers clutched their children tightly, worried about their safety. The fear was palpable, and the search for Sarah dominated every conversation, from coffee shops to local businesses. Sarah's disappearance made the front page of the Greenfield Gazette, a small but trusted newspaper. The headline screamed, "Teenager abducted in broad daylight." The story was everywhere on social media, on the news, and even whispered in the aisles of the local grocery store. The town was in a frenzy, desperate for answers, clinging to whatever information they could find. But what they didn't know, and what they didn't want to know, was that this was about to become a story fueled by assumptions and racial biases. James Turner had been living in Greenfield for years. He was well known, but not for the best reasons. He had moved to the town with his wife, Tasha, and their young daughter, Maya, looking for a fresh start. James had once worked in a high-paying job in the city, but after an unfortunate series of layoffs, he was forced to leave his old life behind. He now worked as a mechanic at a local auto shop, earning just enough to make ends meet. James was a hard-working, quiet man. He kept to himself most of the time, and his family lived modestly in a small house at the edge of town. However, his presence in Greenfield had always been somewhat contentious. Though he was friendly to everyone he met, there were always whispers behind his back. People were skeptical of newcomers, especially people like James, who didn't quite fit the image of the typical Greenfield resident. The people in town didn't know much about James's past, and, to be honest, they didn't really care. They just saw a black man with a family living in a neighborhood that wasn't exactly welcoming to people of color. The quiet whispers of racial prejudice were never far away, but it wasn't something that was often spoken about openly. Still, there were the occasional stares, the cold shoulders, and the subtle hints that James wasn't fully accepted into the community. It wasn't long before the police began investigating Sarah's disappearance, and James's name came up, almost out of nowhere. A witness had claimed to see a black man near the park around the time Sarah was last seen. The witness's description was vague at best, but it was enough to cause a stir. The police, in their desperate search for any lead, decided to focus their attention on James, a man who already stood out in their minds as someone who didn't quite belong. There was no real evidence linking him to Sarah's disappearance, but that didn't stop the investigation from moving forward. James didn't know it yet, but his life was about to be turned upside down. He was at work in the auto shop when the police arrived. They didn't arrest him immediately, but they asked him a series of questions about his whereabouts and whether he knew anything about Sarah. He was confused, but he answered truthfully, telling them he had been at work all morning, fixing a customer's car. He had an alibi, and there was no reason to suspect him. But that didn't stop the officers from taking his name down and making it clear they would be watching him closely. The next day, the situation took a dramatic turn. James was at home with his wife, Tasha, when the police showed up at his door. They told him they had a warrant for his arrest, claiming they had found evidence that linked him to the missing girl. James was stunned. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being accused of something he couldn't even begin to understand. His wife, Tasha, was just as shocked. She tried to reason with the officers, but it was no use. James was taken into custody, his hands shackled, and the entire town was about to witness what would become the most talked about case in Greenfield's history. The news spread like wildfire. The same newspaper that had covered Sarah's disappearance now reported on James's arrest, and the headline this time was even more dramatic: "Local man arrested in connection with teenager's abduction." The story was everywhere, and as soon as the news hit the internet, it spread across social media like wildfire. People were divided, some expressed disbelief, but many more were quick to judge. James became the face of the town's collective fear, the embodiment of the threat they couldn't see but felt deep down. The accusations against him were based solely on circumstantial evidence, but the racial undertones were impossible to ignore. The police hadn't found any direct connection between James and Sarah, but the mere fact that he was a black man living in a town where black people were rare was enough to make many people jump to conclusions. His name was smeared across the news, and the town, once so peaceful, was now rife with anger, fear, and uncertainty. Sarah's parents, devastated and heartbroken over their daughter's disappearance, were naturally desperate for answers. In their grief, they latched onto the idea that James could be responsible for her abduction. The police didn't help matters. Instead of investigating all possibilities, they focused on James, painting him as the villain. The media took that narrative and ran with it, showing pictures of James being led away in handcuffs while Sarah's parents gave emotional interviews, pleading for the safe return of their daughter. It was a tragic situation, but what no one realized was that the real tragedy was that an innocent man was about to be wrongly accused and vilified. James's family stood by him, but even they couldn't help but feel the weight of the community's judgment. Tasha tried to keep their daughter, Maya, shielded from the media, but it was impossible. The constant news coverage, the whispers in the street, and the stares they received from their neighbors were inescapable. James didn't know how long this would last or if his name would ever be cleared, but he was determined to stay strong for his family. He knew that the truth would come out eventually, but the waiting was agonizing. As the days went by, the situation only worsened. James was held in custody, and his bail was set at an amount far beyond what his family could afford. The town was split. Some people were still willing to give James the benefit of the doubt, while others had already made up their minds. The accusations and the media frenzy only grew louder, with each passing day. It was a nightmare that no one had expected in their quiet little town. But for James, it was his new reality. A reality where every look, every whisper, every word spoken about him was a reminder that no matter how innocent he was, his life would never be the same again. James sat in his small, dimly lit cell, his mind racing. The walls of the jail felt as though they were closing in on him, suffocating him with every tick of the clock. He couldn't stop replaying the events that had led to this moment, the moment his life had been torn apart by accusations that made no sense. He had never hurt anyone, let alone a young girl he didn't even know. Yet here he was, behind bars, accused of a crime that felt as foreign to him as the idea of betrayal. His lawyer, a man named Richard Morrow, had visited him several times since his arrest. Richard was a seasoned defense attorney, known for his calm demeanor and level-headed approach to even the most challenging cases. However, as Richard sat across from James in the small visitation room, James could see the concern in his eyes. The case was complicated. The evidence against James was circumstantial, but the weight of the public's anger and the pressure from the police made it seem almost impossible to fight back. "They're building a case against you, James. The town is in an uproar, and the media is feeding the fire," Richard said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of frustration. "They don't want to hear your side. They're so desperate to find someone to blame that they're overlooking the truth." James nodded slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. He had expected this. He had expected the town to turn against him. But hearing Richard's words, and seeing the grim look on his face, made the reality hit even harder. It wasn't just the police or the media, it was the whole town. Every person who had ever looked at him with suspicion, every person who had whispered about him when he passed by, had now turned into a force that was closing in on him. "They're not looking for the truth, Richard," James said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "They just want someone to blame. And because of who I am, because of the way I look, I'm the easiest target." Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped together. You're right. It's a tragedy, James. But that doesn't mean we're out of options. We have to stick to the facts. We have to prove that you were nowhere near the park that day. James sighed deeply, the weight of the situation sinking in. He had an alibi. He had been at work all morning, fixing a car in his shop. He knew the mechanic who had been with him, but that wasn't enough. The police had already decided he was guilty, and no amount of truth seemed to matter. The accusation alone had been enough to paint him as the villain in a story that no one wanted to understand. As the days passed, James's world grew darker. His family tried to stay strong, but even they couldn't escape the whispers and stares that followed them everywhere. Tasha, his wife, was struggling to keep it together. She was doing everything she could to stay strong for their daughter, Maya, but the toll of this nightmare was evident in the lines of stress that had appeared on her face. Maya didn't fully understand what was happening. She was only 10, and she still believed that everything could be fixed with a hug or a kind word. But even she had begun to notice the strange looks people gave them when they walked down the street. At school, Maya had become the subject of cruel teasing. Her classmates didn't know the details, but they had heard enough to know that something was wrong. It wasn't just Sarah's disappearance anymore, it was James. Her father, the one who had always been her protector, her hero, was now the enemy in the eyes of the people around them. One afternoon, as Tasha was picking Maya up from school, a group of parents had gathered near the school gates. They were talking in low voices, their words just loud enough for Tasha to overhear. "I heard the man who did it has been arrested," one of the mothers whispered. "A black man. Figures, doesn't it? It's always someone like that." Tasha's heart sank. She had heard the whispers before, but this time, it was different. It wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about her husband, about their family. She could feel the judgment in the air, like a thick fog that surrounded her every time she left the house. Tasha wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and shout the truth that James was innocent, that he had nothing to do with Sarah's disappearance. But she knew that her words would fall on deaf ears. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the story that everyone had already decided to believe. At night, when the house was quiet and Maya was asleep, Tasha would sit with James. They would talk about the day, about how they were going to get through this, but the words felt hollow. How could they fight a battle when the enemy was not just the police or the media, but an entire community that had already condemned them? As the trial date approached, the tension in the town grew. The courthouse was flooded with reporters, camera crews, and onlookers eager to witness the spectacle. James's lawyer, Richard, worked tirelessly to prepare for the defense, but the challenges were mounting. The prosecution had already begun to paint James as a monster, someone who had snatched Sarah from the streets without a second thought. They had no evidence, no witnesses, but they had the perfect villain. James's trial began on a cold morning in early spring. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with people eager to see justice served or what they thought was justice. The judge, a stern man named Judge Matthews, banged his gavel and called the court to order. The prosecution's opening statement was filled with dramatic language, describing James as a dangerous individual who had used his power and size to overpower Sarah. The evidence was scant, but the emotional appeal was enough to sway the jury. The prosecution made it seem as though James's very presence in the town was a threat, that his race alone was enough to make him guilty in their eyes. When it was time for the defense, Richard stood and addressed the court. His voice was calm, but his words carried the weight of the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the man standing before you is not the monster the prosecution would have you believe. He is a hard-working father, a devoted husband, and a man who has never harmed anyone. The evidence against him is flimsy at best, and the only thing that has brought him here today is the color of his skin." James sat silently as Richard spoke, the words a reminder of how far he had fallen from a respected mechanic in his community to a man fighting for his freedom. He could feel the eyes of the jury on him, judging him before they even knew him. The trial dragged on for days, each one more exhausting than the last. James could barely concentrate. All he could think about was Sarah. Where was she? What had happened to her? His heart ached for the girl who had disappeared, but it was also heavy with the knowledge that he was being made to suffer for a crime he didn't commit. The days turned into weeks, and as the trial continued, the pressure on James and his family mounted. The whispers, the stares, the judgment, it all became too much to bear. James didn't know how much longer he could hold on. But one thing was clear: the truth, no matter how hard they fought for it, seemed like a distant dream. The trial had felt like an eternity, dragging on with no sign of resolution. But then, on the last day of the proceedings, something unexpected happened. The defense team had been preparing for the final arguments when a breakthrough came that none of them had anticipated. It wasn't an explosion of evidence or some dramatic confession, it was simply a small detail, something that had been overlooked until now. But it was enough to change everything. It started with a phone call to Richard Morrow, James's lawyer. Early one morning, just as the defense was about to present its closing arguments, Richard received a call from an investigator who had been going through the records one last time. The investigator had found something crucial: an email exchange between Sarah's parents and the private investigator they had hired to find their daughter. The emails weren't particularly long, but they contained one very important detail: Sarah had been planning to run away. In the messages, Sarah's parents had expressed concern about her behavior, mentioning that Sarah had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. They had been worried about her mental state, and the private investigator they had hired confirmed that Sarah had been making plans to leave without telling anyone. The investigator had been hired to follow Sarah and ensure she wasn't in any kind of danger, but he had never mentioned anything about Sarah being taken by force. Richard had the emails printed and immediately set up a meeting with James. When Richard explained the significance of what they had found, James felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't the end of the fight yet, but it was a step toward the truth. The evidence wasn't enough to clear his name completely, but it was enough to raise serious doubts about the accusation that had been placed on him. "I've seen enough to know this is not what it seems, James," Richard said, looking at his client with a mix of determination and caution. "This changes everything. We have to go public with this, and we have to do it now. The media has been feeding into the idea that you're guilty, but they're ignoring the truth. They're ignoring the fact that Sarah might not have been abducted at all." James felt a surge of hope that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. He knew that the town had already made up its mind about him. The accusations, the court hearings, the media's portrayal of him as the villain, all of that had been building up to a point where he thought there would be no escape. But now, there was a chance. A real chance to clear his name, to show the world that he was innocent. The next few days were a blur. Richard presented the new evidence to the court, and the reaction was immediate. The prosecution tried to dismiss the emails as irrelevant, claiming they had no bearing on Sarah's disappearance. But the defense team pushed back, arguing that the emails raised serious questions about the circumstances surrounding Sarah's vanishing. It wasn't enough to claim that Sarah had been kidnapped without examining the possibility that she had run away on her own accord. The judge, after careful consideration, ruled that the new evidence was admissible. The trial was delayed for a few more days while further investigations were carried out. In the meantime, the media was forced to shift its focus. The narrative began to change, and whispers of Sarah's possible disappearance as a voluntary act spread throughout the town. The public, for the first time, was forced to confront the idea that they had been wrong about James. For James, the shift in the town's mood was both a relief and a frustration. On one hand, the truth was finally starting to emerge, but on the other hand, the damage had already been done. His name had been dragged through the mud. The judgment and suspicion that had been cast upon him could never be fully erased. His family had lived through weeks of torment, and even though the truth was coming out, it didn't change the fact that their lives had been upended. Tasha, for all the worry she had endured, was beginning to feel the weight of the truth as well. The emails had shifted the narrative, but they hadn't erased the pain. As soon as she read the emails, she felt a mix of anger and relief. Anger because the town had been so quick to judge and so slow to ask questions. And relief because she knew that, at least now, there was hope that her husband would be free. Maya, on the other hand, was still too young to understand the full scope of the situation, but she had been affected by the constant attention and the hostile environment at school. Her teachers had started to whisper about her father's trial, and some of her classmates had even stopped talking to her. One afternoon, Maya came home in tears, telling her mother that the kids at school had been saying things about her father that weren't true. Tasha had to hold her daughter and assure her that everything would be okay, but inside, Tasha was struggling. How could she explain to her little girl that people's biases could destroy lives? How could she protect Maya from the harsh realities of the world when even adults couldn't see the truth? In the days that followed, as the investigation into Sarah's disappearance continued, the public began to shift its focus once more. The media, which had once painted James as the villain, now reported on the possibility that Sarah had run away. The news outlets interviewed Sarah's parents again, who reluctantly admitted that they had been unaware of their daughter's plans. The pressure began to mount on the police as they were forced to reconsider their hasty conclusions. The town, which had once been so quick to condemn James, now found itself caught between guilt and confusion. People started to question whether they had been too quick to judge. At the same time, Richard worked tirelessly to expose the flaws in the case against James. The new evidence revealed that Sarah had been in contact with a friend of hers in another town, and the details suggested that Sarah had left voluntarily, not kidnapped. The investigation also uncovered surveillance footage from a nearby gas station that showed Sarah walking alone, unharmed, in the direction of a bus station. The footage, which had been overlooked in the initial investigation, proved that Sarah had not been taken by force. But even as the truth began to surface, there were still those who refused to let go of their beliefs. The prejudices that had shaped the case from the beginning were deeply ingrained in the town, and not everyone was ready to admit they had been wrong. Some people still saw James as the guilty party, the man who was hiding something. The whispers didn't stop, but now, the whispers were mixed with uncertainty. James could feel the weight of all of it. The emotional toll was exhausting, but he knew that the truth was slowly coming to light. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The town would have to reckon with its own mistakes, but James and his family could finally begin to heal. As the days passed, James and his family began to see a shift in the community's perception. The tension that had gripped Greenfield for weeks was slowly beginning to ease, but it was far from over. Even though the truth was becoming clearer, the scars from the past few weeks would not fade easily. There were still whispers in the streets, lingering judgment from people who had already made up their minds. And for James, this was the hardest part, the realization that no matter what happened, things would never return to the way they once were. The town had been divided from the beginning. On one side were those who had blindly accepted the accusations against James, driven by fear and their own biases. On the other side were the few who had always supported him, quietly defending his character and believing in his innocence. But now, with the truth emerging, it was time for those who had condemned James to confront the consequences of their actions. The first signs of change came when the local news stations began airing reports questioning the handling of the case. The once clear-cut narrative of James being the villain started to unravel. The reporters revisited the events leading up to Sarah's disappearance, highlighting the errors in the investigation and the rush to judgment. They interviewed legal experts who pointed out how the police had relied on racial stereotypes rather than hard evidence. Slowly but surely, the media began to pivot, but not without first acknowledging the damage it had done. The police, too, were forced to confront their mistakes. In the face of mounting public pressure, the chief of police, Mayor Thompson, held a press conference to apologize for the mishandling of the case. His voice was steady, but the words he spoke were heavy with regret. "We acted hastily," he admitted. "We failed to thoroughly investigate all the facts, and we failed James Turner. We will learn from this and ensure that something like this never happens again." For James, hearing those words felt like both a victory and a betrayal. The apology, while necessary, couldn't undo the damage. The emotional toll of being falsely accused, of being dragged through a public trial, had left deep scars. And as the town slowly began to reconcile with the truth, James knew that the path to healing would not be easy. While the community worked to rebuild trust, karma, as it often does, began to strike those who had perpetuated the lies about James. The people who had fueled the rumors, the ones who had called for his arrest without considering the facts, found themselves facing the consequences of their actions. Some lost their jobs, their reputations damaged beyond repair. Others who had been too quick to judge saw their own families torn apart by the ripple effects of the case. The accusations against James had sparked a chain reaction, and now, those who had cast stones were learning what it felt like to have their own lives scrutinized. One of the most striking cases was that of Greg Walters, a local businessman who had been one of the loudest voices calling for James's arrest. Greg had used his platform to stoke the flames of fear, posting inflammatory comments on social media and speaking at town meetings about the dangers of people like James. But as the truth came to light, Greg found himself facing a wave of backlash. Customers stopped coming to his store, and his business began to suffer. His reputation, once solid, was now tainted by his role in spreading misinformation. It wasn't long before Greg's business closed down for good. He had lost not only his livelihood but also the trust of the people he had once considered friends. James couldn't bring himself to feel sorry for Greg. After everything that had happened, he couldn't bring himself to pity someone who had been so eager to pass judgment without knowing the truth. Another person who felt the consequences of the case was Officer Daniels, the lead investigator in the case against James. Daniels had been the one to arrest James, the one who had been so certain of his guilt despite the lack of evidence. Now, Daniels was under investigation for misconduct. His actions were being scrutinized, and many began to question whether his biases had influenced the way he handled the case. Though he was still employed by the police department, Daniels had become a figure of disdain in the community. People began to whisper that he was a man who had let his own prejudices cloud his judgment, and the respect he had once commanded was now gone. For James, watching the town begin to take stock of what had happened felt like a bittersweet victory. It was a victory because the truth was finally being recognized, but it was also a painful reminder of the harm that had been done. Karma had arrived, but it had come at a heavy price not just for those who had wronged him but for the entire community. The scars of the past few weeks would linger for a long time, and trust would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. James tried to focus on the future. He tried to focus on his family, on moving forward. But the memories of the trial, the humiliation, and the judgment still haunted him. The pressure of constantly being under the microscope, of having his every move scrutinized, had taken its toll. The emotional toll on Tasha had been just as heavy. She had stood by him through it all, but she too was carrying the weight of the past few weeks. Tasha had spent sleepless nights worrying about James, wondering if he would ever be able to fully recover from the trauma of being falsely accused. She had done her best to shield their daughter, Maya, from the worst of it, but even she couldn't protect her from the whispers and the stares. Maya, once a cheerful and carefree child, had become withdrawn. She had stopped talking about her friends at school, and her grades had begun to slip. It was as if the shadow of the trial had cast a darkness over their entire family. It wasn't until one evening, when the three of them sat down for dinner, that they started to have an honest conversation about what had happened. The silence that had plagued their home finally broke. "I don't know if I can ever forgive them," James said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Tasha and then at Maya, his heart aching for the pain they had all endured. "I don't know if I can ever forget what happened." Tasha reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "I don't know if I can either, James," she said softly. "But we have to keep moving forward. We have to find a way to heal, for Maya, for us." Maya, who had been quiet throughout the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Will people still be mean to us?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. James smiled gently at his daughter, his heart heavy with the burden of what she had endured. "No, sweetheart," he said, squeezing her hand. "People will make mistakes, but we don't have to let them define who we are. We're stronger than they think." The conversation was not easy, but it marked a turning point for their family. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was the beginning of their healing process. They knew that the road ahead would be long, but they also knew they had each other. The weight of the past few weeks still hung over them, but with each passing day, they began to feel a little lighter. James had been through hell, but he had come out the other side, stronger and more determined to rebuild his life. And as the town of Greenfield slowly began to heal, James and his family started to rebuild their own lives as well. Karma had struck, and the truth had finally been revealed. But now, it was time for forgiveness, for healing, and for moving forward. As the weeks passed, the town of Greenfield began to rebuild. The tension that had once gripped the streets slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of normalcy. People went back to their daily routines, but the scars of the past few months remained. It wasn't just the pain of the false accusations against James that lingered, it was the realization that the town had been divided, that people had allowed their fears and biases to cloud their judgment. The road to healing was long, and for James and his family, it was still a journey that was far from over. But as time moved forward, James found himself changing. He had always been a quiet man, content to live his life without drawing attention to himself. But the events of the past few months had forced him to confront something he could no longer ignore, the deep-seated prejudices that had shaped the way people viewed him. The trial, the false accusations, and the media frenzy had opened his eyes to the harsh realities of the world. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about all the people who had been wronged, the ones who had been silenced and ignored because of who they were or how they looked. James didn't want to be a victim of the system anymore. He didn't want to sit idly by and let the world continue to turn a blind eye to the injustice that plagued it. He knew that his own journey wasn't over. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. One day, as James was sitting in his small garage, working on a car, he received an unexpected call. It was from Richard Morrow, his lawyer. "James, I've been talking to some people," Richard said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "There's a group organizing a rally for criminal justice reform. They want to know if you'd be willing to speak." James was taken aback. A rally? Criminal justice reform? It was the last thing he had expected. He had been focused on rebuilding his life, on getting back to some semblance of normal. But now, here was an opportunity to do something bigger. Something that could make a difference. "I don't know, Richard," James said, his voice uncertain. "I've never been a public speaker. I don't know if I can do it." "I know it's a big step, James," Richard said, his tone gentle. "But you've lived through something that most people will never understand. Your story, your voice, it can make a difference. People need to hear it. They need to see what's at stake when the system fails." James thought about it for a long time. He thought about the people who had stood by him, the ones who had believed in him when it seemed like no one else did. He thought about Maya, who had gone through so much for someone so young. And he thought about Tasha, who had been his rock through it all, her strength and unwavering support never faltering. He couldn't let this opportunity slip away. Not when it could help others, not when it could bring attention to the issues that had torn apart his life. "I'll do it," James said, his voice firm with resolve. "I'll speak at the rally." The day of the rally arrived, and Greenfield's small town square was filled with people, hundreds of them. The atmosphere was charged with energy, a mix of hope and determination. The crowd was diverse, made up of people from all walks of life, all united by the common goal of seeking justice and reform. James stood at the back of the crowd, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. He had never been the type of person to seek attention, to put himself in the spotlight. But now, as he watched the speakers take their places on the stage, he felt a deep sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about everyone who had ever been wrongfully accused, about everyone who had been silenced by a system that didn't care. When it was his turn to speak, James stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the weight of their expectations heavy on his shoulders. But as he looked out over the sea of faces, something inside him shifted. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't a victim. He was a man with a story, a man who had something important to say. "I've been through a lot these past few months," James began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I've been accused of something I didn't do. I've been judged, humiliated, and torn apart by a system that should have been protecting me. But the truth is, I'm not the only one. There are people in this town, in this country, who have been wrongfully accused, who have been ignored, who have been treated like they don't matter. And we can't stand for that anymore." The crowd was silent, hanging on to every word James spoke. He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I've spent my whole life trying to stay out of the way, trying to avoid trouble. But now I realize that staying silent, staying quiet, it doesn't solve anything. We need to speak out. We need to fight for justice, for equality. We need to stand up for the people who have been overlooked and forgotten. We need to change the system." The crowd erupted into applause, and James felt a wave of emotion wash over him. For the first time in months, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He wasn't just telling his story, he was giving a voice to all those who had been silenced. He was part of something bigger than himself. After the rally, James was approached by several people who had heard his speech. They expressed their gratitude and admiration for his courage, and some even offered to help him in his efforts to push for reform. James realized that he wasn't alone in this fight. There were people out there who were willing to stand with him, to support him as he worked to make sure that what had happened to him never happened to anyone else. As the weeks went by, James began to see the ripple effects of his actions. The conversation about criminal justice reform continued to grow, with more people in Greenfield and beyond taking notice of the issues that had once been overlooked. The media coverage, which had once focused solely on his trial, now included stories about the need for systemic change. And James, for the first time, felt like he was part of something truly important. But the journey wasn't easy. The road to justice was long and filled with obstacles. There were still those who refused to admit their mistakes, who clung to the outdated beliefs and prejudices that had fueled the injustice in the first place. But James was no longer afraid of the fight. He had been through too much to back down now. And with each step, he grew stronger. For James, the fight for justice was not just about clearing his name, it was about creating a world where people were treated equally, where the color of someone's skin didn't determine their worth or their fate. He knew it would take time, but he was determined to make a difference. And with the support of his family, his community, and the people who had rallied behind him, James was ready to face whatever came next.